Harlow had been humiliated before, but never like this. Never in a room full of 150 people who had spent their careers building reputations that lived and died on the quality of their judgment. Never at a podium. Never with a microphone carrying every word to the back row. Her parents were both physicians, respected, decorated, the kind of doctors whose names appeared on hospital wings and conference programs. They had spent 30 years building a professional legacy that the entire room recognized and admired. And in front of all of it, in front of every colleague, every former student, every administrator who had watched them build that legacy, they had chosen to make an example of Harlow, not their medical achievements, not their research. Harlow, their daughter who had left medicine. Their daughter who had, in their words, wasted everything they had invested in her future. Their daughter who had chosen a different path at 25 and had the audacity to believe that choice was hers to make. They had worked her into a keynote address. A passing reference that lasted 40 seconds and carried the specific weight of a verdict delivered in public by people with the credentials to make it stick. Harlow had been sitting in the fourth row. She had heard every word. She had not moved, because the man 3 seats to her left had heard it too. And he was already reaching for the folder he had carried into that conference room for exactly this reason. Before Dr. Cross stands up in that conference room and opens that folder, hit subscribe right now. Because what he presents in front of 150 physicians is 7 years of work that Harlow's parents spent 7 years refusing to see. New videos every single week, and this one is only getting started. Hit like if you have ever built something extraordinary, while the people who should have been proudest look the other way. Drop a comment. Have you ever had someone defend you in a room where you couldn't defend yourself? Now let's go back to Seattle, because Harlow just heard her parents' words from the fourth row. And 3 seats away, a folder is already opening. My name is Harlow. I am 32 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. 7 years ago, I walked away from medical school at the end of my first year, and I have not spent a single day since regretting that decision, which I understand is not the narrative my parents would tell about the same set of facts. I had been accepted to a good program. I had the grades and the scores and the discipline that the process required. And I had sat in that first year of training with the growing and undeniable understanding that I was in the wrong place, not because medicine wasn't important, but because the way I could contribute to it most meaningfully was not going to happen inside a clinical setting. I left. My parents treated it like a death in the family. My dad was a neurosurgeon, the kind whose name appeared on a wing of the hospital where he had practiced for 25 years, whose residents sent him cards on their match days, whose professional reputation was so established it had become its own kind of weather system that everything around him organized itself in relation to. My mom was a research cardiologist, papers, citations, the particular authority of someone whose work had been replicated in other labs on other continents. They had met in medical school, built their careers in parallel, and raised me and my brother in a household where medicine was not a career choice but a definition of serious personhood. My brother became a pediatrician. I became the other one, the one who had left, the one who had chosen something they couldn't fully explain at dinner parties. When I left medical school, my parents did not have one difficult conversation with me and then found a way to accept my decision. They had the same difficult conversation repeatedly across 7 years, sometimes directly, sometimes through the particular architecture of family gatherings, where the questions people ask tell you more than their answers. How is the writing going was asked in a tone that made writing sound like a hobby someone picked up after a minor personal setback. Do you ever think about going back? I was asked at least once a year, reliably, with the optimism of people who had decided that my current life was a temporary detour rather than the actual destination. They were not cruel about it. They were consistent about it, which over 7 years accumulated into something that felt more permanent than cruelty. What my parents did not do during those 7 years was pay attention to what I was building. Not because the information wasn't available. My work was public, documented, findable by anyone who looked. But looking would have required a level of genuine curiosity about my life that their disappointment had crowded out. They knew I wrote about health policy. They knew I ran some kind of organization. They knew I was in Seattle and that I seemed to be managing financially and that I occasionally traveled for work. They had assembled these facts into a vague picture of a daughter who was doing fine at something small, fine being the word families use when they have decided not to engage with the full complexity of what someone is actually doing. I had stopped trying to correct the picture a long time ago. The invitation to the conference came in an email from my mom in early September, formal, with the conference details attached, a note that said she and my dad would both be speaking, and that they would love for me to be there. I read it twice. The phrasing was warmer than usual. The word love appeared without the qualification that usually surrounded it when my parents addressed my professional world. I called my college friend Priya after reading it and said I thought it might be an olive branch, that maybe 7 years was long enough, and they were reaching across in the way that people sometimes reached across when they couldn't quite find the direct language for it. Priya said that was possible. She also said to keep my expectations measured. I said I would. I confirmed my attendance and booked a flight to Chicago. I arrived at the conference venue on a Thursday morning, a large hotel ballroom configured for the keynote, round tables, good sight lines to the stage, the particular energy of a professional gathering where everyone in the room shared a common vocabulary and a common sense of what mattered. I found my name on the attendee list at registration and collected my badge and walked into the ballroom and chose a seat in the fourth row, close enough to see my parents clearly when they took the stage, far enough back to feel like a member of the audience rather than a prop in whatever the morning had planned. I set my bag under my chair. I accepted a conference program from the volunteer moving through the rows. I found my parents' names listed as the keynote speakers. I was genuinely looking forward to hearing them speak. I always had been, even through everything. The keynote was substantive and well delivered. My parents were genuinely accomplished speakers, and the room was engaged throughout. 40 minutes in, my mom made a pivot in the address toward a broader reflection on legacy and the responsibility of the medical community to inspire the next generation. She spoke about the weight of potential, about what it meant to watch someone with exceptional capability choose a path beneath what they were capable of. She said it generally, philosophically, in the way keynote speakers addressed universal themes. And then my dad, at the podium beside her, added a specific detail, a reference to someone close to them, someone who had been given every advantage and every opportunity, who had walked away from a calling to pursue something smaller. He said it without saying my name. He didn't need to. I was in the fourth row. And so were 149 other people who now had a specific image in their minds to attach to the words he had just said. Harlow had not left medical school and drifted. She had left medical school and immediately moved toward something with the same focused energy she had brought to everything since she was 17. The first year out, she had taken a position as a research writer for a public health nonprofit in Seattle, entry level, underpaid, exactly the right place to learn the landscape of health policy from the inside. She had spent that year reading legislation, attending public comment sessions, understanding how policy moved from academic research into actual law. By the end of year one, she had written 3 substantial policy briefs that her organization had submitted to the state legislature. One of them had been cited in committee testimony. She was 26 years old. The citations had accumulated over 7 years in the quiet way that credibility accumulated when the work was consistent and the documentation was thorough. The first congressional citation had come in year 3, a Senate subcommittee hearing on Medicaid expansion, where a policy brief Harlow had authored was entered into the testimony record by a senator from Washington state. She had been sitting in her Seattle apartment when her organization's executive director called to tell her. She had said thank you and meant it fully. Then she went back to the brief she was currently writing. By the time she sat in that conference room in Chicago, she had been cited in congressional testimony 4 separate times across 2 different legislative sessions. She had never mentioned any of it to her parents. They had never asked. The nonprofit had started in year 3, not as a strategic career move, but as a response to a specific gap she had identified through her policy work. There was no organization in the Pacific Northwest dedicated specifically to translating complex health legislation into accessible advocacy materials for community health workers, the people on the ground who needed to understand policy changes in order to help their patients navigate them. Harlow had seen the gap clearly and had started filling it with the same practical directness she brought to everything. She had registered the organization, found 2 co-founders through her professional network, and operated out of her apartment for the first 8 months. By year 5, she had 12 full-time staff, a proper office in Capitol Hill, and a budget that her board reviewed quarterly. The number her organization was most proud of was not a revenue figure or an award citation. It was a patient access number that her program director had calculated carefully and conservatively at their 5-year review. 40,000 underserved patients across Washington and Oregon had gained access to mental health services through policy changes that Harlow's organization had directly influenced, through legislative advocacy, through community education campaigns, through the specific and unglamorous work of making sure that policy language translated into actual clinical access for people who had previously fallen through the gaps. Her dad had spent his career operating on individual patients with exceptional skill. Harlow had spent 7 years working on the systems that determined whether patients could reach a doctor at all. Both things mattered. Only one of them had been invited to the keynote. The first national award had come in year 4, the American Public Health Association's Emerging Leader Recognition, presented at their annual conference in Philadelphia. Harlow had attended, accepted the award, given a brief acknowledgement speech, and flown home to Seattle the following morning. She had posted a brief note on her organization's social media accounts because her communications director had asked her to. She had not called her parents. The second award came 2 years later, a foundation-level recognition for nonprofit health advocacy that came with a significant grant that had funded her organization's expansion into a third state. She had told her team, taken them to dinner, and gone home. She had added both awards to her professional biography and her organization's About page. Neither of her parents had ever mentioned seeing them. Dr. Elliot Cross had been a health policy professor at the University of Washington for 18 years, the kind of academic whose influence operated through his students and his recommendations rather than through self-promotion, which was precisely why his endorsements carried the weight they did in the health policy community. He had first encountered Harlow's work as the external examiner assigned to her undergraduate thesis, an unusually sophisticated analysis of Medicaid reimbursement structures that he had read twice, and then forwarded to 2 colleagues with a note saying he wanted them to see what an undergraduate was capable of producing. He had not been surprised when she left medical school. He had been watching her think for 3 years, and he had understood before she did that her mind worked in the direction of systems rather than individual patients. Dr. Cross had not set out to compile a comprehensive record of Harlow's career. It had accumulated the way documentation accumulated when you paid attention to someone's work over a long period of time. He had saved her policy briefs when they crossed his desk in professional contexts. He had noted the congressional citations in his own research files. He had added her organization's annual impact reports to a folder he had originally labeled simply with her name, and then stopped relabeling as it grew. By the time the conference invitation arrived in his inbox, the folder was substantial, not exhaustive, but thorough enough to constitute a serious professional portrait of 7 years of consequential work. He had used it 3 times already, twice when recommending her for speaking engagements, once when a colleague had asked him who was doing the most significant health policy advocacy work in the Pacific Northwest. He had said her name without hesitation. Dr. Cross had received his conference invitation 6 weeks before the event, a formal request from the Hospital Foundation's Program Committee asking him to serve as a panelist on the afternoon health policy integration session. It was the kind of invitation he received regularly and accepted selectively. He said yes to rooms where the conversation would be substantive and the audience would be genuinely engaged with the material rather than simply present for professional obligation. He had reviewed the conference program before confirming and found it serious and well-constructed. He had noted the morning keynote speakers, recognized both names immediately from their research reputations. He had confirmed his attendance, booked his travel, and returned to the semester's work without particular anticipation in either direction. Then he saw the attendee list. The full attendee list had been distributed 3 weeks before the conference, standard practice for events where networking was part of the professional value. Dr. Cross read through it with the habit of someone who used these lists to identify conversations worth having in the margins of the formal program. He found Harlow's name on the 3rd page, listed simply with her organization name and her Seattle address, the same information everyone else had submitted. He had stopped on it for a moment. He knew her parents were the keynote speakers. He knew Harlow's relationship with her parents had been complicated since she left medical school. She had mentioned it once, briefly, in the specific way people mention things they had made their peace with and no longer needed to explain at length. He pulled up her contact information and sent a short email. His email had been brief. He said he had seen her name on the attendee list, that he was presenting on the afternoon panel, and that he hoped they might find time to connect during one of the breaks. He said he had been following her organization's work on the mental health access expansion and wanted to hear more about where the 3rd state rollout was heading. Harlow had responded within a day, warmly, specifically, asking a question about his current research that demonstrated she had been following his work as consistently as he had been following hers. They had exchanged 2 more emails before the conference. She had not mentioned her parents' keynote. He had not asked about it. The professional thread of their correspondence had carried its own comfortable weight without needing to touch the personal one. The folder had not been assembled as a rebuttal to anything. That was the important thing about it, the thing that gave it its particular credibility. Dr. Cross had not built it because he anticipated needing to defend Harlow in a public setting. He had built it because he recommended people based on documented evidence rather than general impressions, and Harlow was someone he recommended consistently enough that having her career record organized and accessible saved him time. He had used it most recently 4 months before the conference, when a national health policy symposium had contacted him asking for speaker recommendations in the emerging voices category. He had pulled the folder, selected the most relevant documentation, and sent it as part of his recommendation letter. Harlow had been invited. She had delivered what he had been told was one of the strongest presentations of the symposium. He had packed the folder on the morning of his flight to Chicago with the practical intention of having Harlow's documentation on hand for the afternoon panel. He had planned to reference her organization's mental health access work as a case study during the health policy integration discussion and wanted the specific numbers available rather than relying on memory. He placed it in his conference bag alongside his panel notes and his laptop and his standard collection of professional materials. He had not thought about the keynote when he packed it. He had not imagined a scenario in which the folder's contents would be relevant to the morning session. He was an academic who prepared thoroughly for known situations. What happened during the keynote was not a situation he had prepared for. It was a situation he recognized when it arrived. He had arrived at the ballroom early, the habit of someone who liked to orient himself in a space before it filled. He had chosen a seat in the fourth row near the center aisle, which gave him good sight lines to the stage and easy exit access for the panel setup he would need to manage before the afternoon session. Harlow had arrived 20 minutes later and worked her way along the fourth row to a seat 3 chairs from his. He had nodded hello, and she had smiled in the way of 2 people who had been corresponding professionally for years, but were meeting in person for only the second time. They had exchanged a few words about the morning program. She had seemed settled and genuinely present. He had returned to his panel notes. Neither of them had known yet what the morning was going to require of them. He had been following the keynote with genuine professional attention. The research was solid and the delivery was accomplished, and the room was engaged in the way good keynotes engaged rooms. When the tone shifted toward legacy and potential, he had noted it as a standard rhetorical move in addresses of this kind, the pivot toward the human element that gave clinical and research content its emotional grounding. He had heard the first comment from Harlow's mom and registered it as general. Then her dad had added the specific detail, close to them, every advantage, walked away, and Dr. Cross had felt the particular recognition that came from having spent enough years in enough professional rooms to know exactly what was happening. He had looked 3 seats to his right. Harlow was sitting completely still with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the stage. The keynote ended with the kind of applause that well-delivered addresses received from professional audiences, sustained, genuine, the room's collective acknowledgement of 2 accomplished physicians who had spoken with authority and clarity for 50 minutes. Harlow clapped. She clapped because not clapping would have been a statement, and she had not come to Chicago to make statements. She clapped with her hands and kept her face composed and watched her parents at the podium, receiving the room's appreciation with the ease of people entirely comfortable being recognized. The 40 seconds had happened and the keynote had continued, and the room had moved on in the way rooms moved on from things they had not been asked to examine. Harlow had not moved on, but she was still sitting in her seat, still composed, still present. The session moderator announced a brief Q&A window before the morning break, standard conference format, 5 minutes, 2 or 3 questions from the floor. Hands went up around the room. The moderator called on a woman near the back who asked about research funding structures. Her dad answered it thoroughly. The moderator was about to move to the second question when Dr. Cross raised his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, just a clean, deliberate raise that the moderator acknowledged immediately because he was a recognizable figure in that room, and his raised hand carried the weight of someone who raised it specifically rather than habitually. Harlow saw it in her peripheral vision. She turned her head 3 seats to the left. Dr. Cross was already standing, folder open in one hand, reading glasses on, completely unhurried. Dr. Cross identified himself clearly before saying anything else: name, institution, his role as afternoon panelist, his 18 years in health policy research at the University of Washington. He delivered it in the professional shorthand of someone who understood that in a room of credentialed people, credentials established the frame before content filled it. The room gave him the particular quality of attention reserved for people whose standing in the relevant field was recognized and respected. Her parents at the podium received his introduction with the polite attentiveness of keynote speakers in Q&A mode, her mom with a slight professional smile, her dad with the neutral readiness of someone expecting a research question. Dr. Cross said he had a point of professional clarification he wanted to offer to the room before everyone broke for coffee. He said during the address there was a reference to someone close to the speakers, someone described as having walked away from a calling to pursue something smaller. He said it without inflection, without editorial framing, the way a person cited a specific passage in a document they were about to address. He did not look at Harlow when he said it. He did not look at her parents with anything that could be read as accusation. He looked at the room, at the 150 physicians who had heard the reference 40 minutes ago, and had filed it in the general category of keynote rhetorical color without particular examination. He said, I want to offer some professional context for that characterization, because I believe the record in this room is currently incomplete. He opened the folder. He started with the legislation, because legislation was the most concrete form of professional impact available in the health policy field, and a room full of physicians understood the distance between academic work and actual law. He said Harlow's policy briefs had directly influenced Medicaid expansion legislation in 3 states, named the states, named the legislative sessions, named the specific provisions her work had shaped. He said her writing had been cited in congressional testimony 4 times across 2 separate legislative sessions. He said the names of the senators who had entered her work into the record. He said it all at the pace of someone presenting evidence, rather than performing, clearly, specifically, with the documentation open in front of him as reference. The room was very quiet. He continued without pause, moving from the legislative work to the nonprofit with the same measured delivery. He named the organization, its founding year, its current staff, its operational reach across 3 states. He presented the mental health access number, 40,000 underserved patients, with the careful qualification that it was a conservative calculation based on the organization's own methodology. He mentioned the 2 national awards with their issuing bodies and their years. He referenced the congressional record citations a second time in a different context, noting that they appeared in the record not as supporting citations but as primary sources, which was a different and more significant category of recognition. He spoke for 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He did not editorialize once. He simply presented the record as it existed and let the room do its own arithmetic. When he finished presenting, he looked down at the folder briefly, not reading anything, just the natural pause of someone who has come to the end of a prepared presentation and is making sure nothing has been omitted. Then he looked up at the room, not at Harlow's parents specifically. In the room, at the 150 physicians who had heard a characterization 40 minutes ago and were now in possession of a substantially different picture. He said, I wanted to make sure the record in this room was accurate. He said it in the same even professional tone he had used throughout, no triumph in it, no performance of vindication, just the simple statement of someone who had introduced a factual correction and considered his responsibility discharged. Then he closed the folder and sat down. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in a room of 150 people who had just received a significant piece of information was a considerable silence. It was not the silence of confusion or discomfort. It was the silence of a professional audience processing a recalibration, the specific quiet of people who had filed something one way 40 minutes ago and were now refiling it in a different and more accurate place. The moderator broke it by thanking Dr. Cross for context and announced the morning break, 15 minutes, coffee in the atrium. The chairs moved. Conversation resumed at the volume of a room returning to its normal register. Harlow sat in her seat for a moment without moving and looked at the stage where her parents were still standing. Her mom's expression during Dr. Cross's presentation had moved through several versions. The first was the polite professional attention she directed at any conference contributor. The second was a slight recalibration as the content became clear. And the third was something more internal and less readable that had settled over her face by the time he sat down and had not fully lifted when the moderator called the break. Her dad had stood very still throughout, the particular stillness of a man whose professional composure was well practiced enough to hold under most circumstances, but whose eyes had done something when Dr. Cross read the congressional citation, numbers that his expression had not quite managed to follow and correct in time. They had built their careers on the credibility of precise information. A peer had just delivered precise information about their daughter in their room. Harlow had made it to the atrium and accepted a coffee before the first person approached her, a woman who introduced herself as the chief of community medicine at a hospital in Ohio, and said she had been trying to find an organization doing exactly what Harlow's nonprofit did for the past 18 months. She asked 3 specific questions about the mental health access expansion model and whether it was replicable in a Midwestern context. Before Harlow had finished answering the second question, a man from a hospital system in Minnesota had joined the conversation. He had looked up the organization on his phone during the break and said the annual impact report was one of the clearest pieces of health advocacy documentation he had read in years. A third physician arrived before the first 2 left. Harlow answered every question with the ease of someone speaking about work they knew completely. Her dad appeared in the atrium hallway during the last 5 minutes of the break, after the Ohio physician had moved on and before the afternoon session bell. He had his jacket over one arm and his conference badge slightly askew the way it got when he had been moving through a room quickly. He said her name, and she turned and looked at him with the composed attention she had been giving everyone that morning. He said the presentation had been, and then he paused in the middle of the sentence for long enough that the pause became its own communication. He said he hadn't realized the scope of what she had built. He said it carefully, like a man choosing words that were true rather than words that were easy. She looked at him steadily and waited for him to finish. Harlow received her dad's approach without filling the space around it. She did not rush to make him comfortable. She did not provide the reassurance that would have allowed the conversation to move past the difficult part too quickly. She listened to what he said, and she responded honestly, and she did not perform either coldness or warmth. She was simply present in the way she had learned to be present with her parents after 7 years of understanding that the relationship required her to be clear rather than strategic. She said she was glad he knew now. She said the work had never been a secret, it had been available to anyone who looked. She said she had stopped announcing it because the announcements had never seemed to land anywhere that mattered. She said it without accusation. She said it as a simple fact about the 7 years they had all just lived through. Dr. Cross found her just before the afternoon session. She was at the back of the room, reviewing her notes from the morning's conversations, 3 business cards already in her jacket pocket from the break. He came over without preamble and held out the folder. He said she should keep it, that he had the original files and could rebuild it any time, and that she had earned every page of what was inside it. Harlow took it and held it for a moment. She opened the cover briefly, her name on the first page and the label he had typed 7 years ago, and updated each time something new was added. She looked at the thickness of it. 7 years of work that someone had considered worth preserving before she had thought to preserve it herself. She closed it and said thank you in the way she said things that she meant completely. Harlow left the conference hotel at 6, after the afternoon panel, after the closing reception, after a conversation with Dr. Cross about a joint project they had been circling for 2 years and had finally agreed to begin in January. She drove to the airport with the folder on the passenger seat and the 3 business cards in her jacket, and the particular quality of tiredness that came from a day that had required more of her than she had expected when she woke up that morning. She thought about the 4 seconds of silence after Dr. Cross sat down. She thought about her mom's expression at the podium. She thought about her dad in the hallway choosing words that were true rather than easy. She thought about 40,000 patients who had access to mental health services because she had left medicine and done something else with what she knew. The flight home was 2 hours. She spent the first hour reading the folder from the beginning, every page of it in order, quietly and completely, for the very first time.